Hi, my name is Ed Wehan. Welcome to this episode of Our Ventura. I'm pleased to have with me today noted expert in bees, Carlos Viscarra. Carlos, thanks so much for being here today.
Well, thank you for having me.
Maybe to start out with, you can give us a little bit of your background with bees, how you got into bees, and just some context of what we're talking about.
Sure. So when I graduated college in 2005 from University of California, Riverside, I went home and I had a family friend who his grandfather owned a local beekeeping business, and he fell ill. He had a heart attack. He's fine, but he needed some help, just part-timers to come on and help do the work. Mm-hmm. And so my friend and I started helping them, and for me, turned into a full-time gig. And so I was learning from him, and he'd been in the business for almost 50 years at that time.
Oh.
Yeah.
And this was in the Riverside area?
No, this is actually in the San Luis Obispo area,
okay.
in Atascadero. And
okay.
so he was mainly a honey producer up there. He did farmers markets and moved all the bees around there for local wildflowers and things like that.
All right. So he was producing honey for the retail market.
Yes.
And how is that done? How does a person manage the hives and create that kind of a product for resale?
Yeah, so he has all the hives, and we move them from location to location. We really follow the flowers. Wherever the flowers are blooming, that's where we want the bees. And the different flowers, they produce different honeys, different mm-hmm. colors, different tastes, all sorts of things. And so from there, we take the hives, and once they're full of honey, we actually bring the honey to the top of the hive, the frames,
right.
And then we drive the bees down using this special substance that just kind of smells funny.
Uh-huh.
And so then we can take the honey right off the hive, a box at a time. And then we load it up and take it home. And then we cut the sides of the frames, spin out the honey, and there you go, raw unfiltered honey.
Is there a lot of people in the United States that have a business like that? Is it a very big business?
It is a big business, but it's actually smaller than the pollination business. Pollination has recently become a much bigger deal. It's a much,
right.
Financially, they can do a lot better on it. But nowadays you kind of need to be able to do both to survive.
Okay, let's talk about pollination and that side of the business and how it works, because it is pretty impactful on all of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people like fruits and all those flowers, they all need to be pollinated, and some of them multiple times. So around here, I was working with a company, and we're doing raspberry pollination.
Okay.
And so the raspberry, it's a multi-ovarian flower, has multiple ovaries on it. It actually has to be pollinated 4 or 5 times for it to produce a full and complete berry. And if it doesn't, the berry just falls apart, and they can't sell it. It's useless to them. And so we would go and we would put our hives right in those fields, as close as possible to the actual sections that were blooming. And so that way the bees will fly out, go get their flowers, and everybody wins if they bring back some nectar and make some honey.
Right.
So.
Now, our area here is big in strawberries.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a similar kind of a process?
Strawberries don't need as much. They can be wind pollinated and other things just because they're lower on the ground, the flower's more exposed. They just don't need as much. And the other thing about strawberries is that they spray them with a lot of stuff, and so a lot of beekeepers try to avoid strawberries.
I see.
Mm-hmm.
I see. One of the things, pollination is obviously a big business, mm-hmm. and I read somewhere, I think, that there aren't like a lot of people that do pollination kinds of things, but they have pretty big businesses, and they move throughout the country. Mm-hmm. And I read where there was a guy in Florida who trucks all his bees out here for the almonds in probably, February, March?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then moves north to Washington State, then all over. Isn't that stressful on the bees? I mean, how does that movement, how does that affect the bees?
It is a little stressful on them, definitely. The hardest part there is that when they're moving them those long distances, they're moving them during the day. They have the big semis, and they have to net them down so the bees don't fly.
Right.
And so they still try to fly, and so there's a lot of them that die. And I've heard a statistic that something like 25% of the bees that are shipped from the East Coast to the West Coast for pollination die in the shipping process. So it's really hard on the bees. When we're moving them here locally, we can do it in an evening. We pick them up, at dusk, unload them at dawn.
Right.
The bees don't know, they're not the wiser to it. All of a sudden they wake up and they're in a new spot, and they need to kind of relocate, and it just takes them a few days. It's not a big deal. We don't lose anything in the process.
Right. So your business is local, But a lot of businesses aren't local, and as you suggest, they move them around the country. So in some ways, are your bees healthier than, say, a bee that's being trucked around as often as those are?
Yeah, typically. And for pollination, they actually, for big pollination like almonds, they have inspectors that come in to inspect your hives, and they'll give it a rating on how strong the hive is.
Yeah.
And the local bees are always stronger than the ones that are brought in from somewhere else. Those guys are always having to push hives together and try to make it work to get the amount of bees that they need to pass inspection. Whereas the local guys, we just send everything and it's all going to pass. We don't have to worry about it too much.
Are the almond growers up there in the Central Valley one of the major users, I suppose, of pollination bees?
They're a big one. California produces 3/4 of the world's almonds, and only a bee can pollinate an almond. So it's a very special flower. It's kind of deep in there, and so the bee has to crawl in, and then when they get to the nectar, it actually kind of bumps them on the head a little, and so they don't really like that, and so most bugs won't go after it. So it has to be bees to pollinate almonds. So it's huge industry, definitely.
Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about how the environment affects pollination. Those things that make it easier or more difficult. And I know briefly we've talked a little bit about the drought. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, when we're doing pollination, the bees, they go after the, whatever's closest, and they'll go after those pollination flowers. But in addition to that, they also fly and try to find other sources of food. They don't want just one source. Person can't just live on bread. You need other things. And so the bees, they'll try to go after the local wildflowers, anything that's nearby. They'll fly up to 2 miles. Really? And so, they'll fly up to 5, but they don't like to fly more than 2. And so with the recent drought, there's not as many wildflowers. So it's a lot harder on the bees just because they don't have those other sources to bring in the nectar. So
is that a big challenge for bees in the bee industry, that you have sort of these crops and they're in these fields, but you don't have the variations, as you suggest, the wildflowers and other things, so the bees are concentrated into like one flower type. That has to affect them in some ways?
Yeah, definitely it does. It just leads to a lot of health issues with the bees. The biggest thing that a beekeeper does is they prevent illness, they prevent everything. We're constantly going through the hives looking for symptoms so that we can be ahead of the game and try to keep them strong. And pollination, it's a good source for pollen, but the flower might not be a great source for nectar. And so the bees really need both. And so if they're only getting tons of pollen but no nectar off the whatever they're pollinating, then it's hard to make it work for them.
Let's talk about probably one of the big subjects in this area, which are pesticides. The effect, obviously, as you mentioned, with strawberries and a lot of crops, pesticides are used. Is there a significant impact on the bees?
There can be a really big impact. A lot of local growers, they're starting to get wiser to it, and they're spraying at night, and they're spraying things that last a shorter duration on the plant, so that it won't get the bees as hard. But it's a very big deal. And the honeycomb, it's almost like a sponge. And when the bees bring back nectar that has that pesticide in it already, and then they put it into their honeycombs, then the wax starts to soak up that pesticide, and then you get all these hives that they're getting abandoned and people don't know why. Then they go and they test the honeycomb, and it's full of pesticides. The bees know. So
are there any regulations either at the state level or the federal level having to do with pesticides in the pollination process?
There are, but they're not that far-reaching. In the old days, they used to be crop dusting, and anybody would have to give us 48 hours notice before they're going to come in and go with the plane and crop dust, and we could get our bees out of there. Now it's systemics. They put it in the water that they irrigate with, and they don't have to tell anybody. So it's the game has changed quite a bit. There's starting to be more concern, in the recent years. But it's still not enough.
Does that affect you as a beekeeper or another commercial beekeeper in choosing who your clientele might be, in that it might be impactful on your bees?
Yeah, and it's more far-reaching than that too, because it's not just our client, but it's the surrounding area too. One particular farm can have great practices, but then they're next to other farms that don't have great practices, and so those the spray will drift. They use harmful stuff that stays on the plants for weeks and weeks, and it's very hurtful to the bees.
Here in Ventura County, certainly the city of Ventura, the various cities, and the county, we have managed our growth and our housing growth with legislation called SOAR, which protects our agricultural resources. What is the effect on bees of increased urbanization in areas?
Well, it's when they're building more houses, they're taking away a lot of the, the wildflowers and other stuff.
Right.
And as they encroach on those agricultural sections, people don't really like bees on the whole. A lot of people are afraid of them. They don't even know if they're allergic or not. They don't know if their children are allergic. And so they just don't want bees around. And so we can have certain areas that have been great areas for bees in the past, but now there's houses there and the people complain and they don't want bees around there. And then we can't put bees back there anymore.
Right.
We lose that area.
Right.
So it's, yeah.
Yeah, it's true of most wildlife, I think, that we've seen. But is there a difference between, and maybe you could help me out here, is there a difference between regular wild bees and commercial bees? I mean, like in my backyard, I'm guessing my bees are just, they don't go to some commercial person like you.
They're pretty much the same. There's a lot of local bees as well that don't necessarily produce honey.
Okay.
A lot of like carpenter bees and other little smaller bees. And, they're not honey producers, but they
Right.
do some work for pollination and other
Right.
things.
Right.
So there really isn't much of a difference. Just the hive location, really, that it's just wild and it does what it does.
Yeah.
And sometimes it mixes with, if there's Africanized bees in the area, they'll kind of interbreed and get a mix, and
Right.
and that can be harmful too.
Right. For us, I guess, population, our civilization, we probably rely on having a population of wild bees in addition to what's commercial as well. So, I mean, I'm guessing people in their homes having flowers and putting out more drought-resistant, climate-friendly kinds of plants probably helps the bee population.
Yeah, it helps the local bee population, definitely. I mean, the commercial beekeeper doesn't, we're not going close to homes anyways.
Exactly.
So, but yeah, during the swarm season, the bees, they just naturally split themselves and swarm off, and that's how they increase their numbers. Who knows where those swarms land? And they
Right.
land in, in trees and neighborhoods, and then they're, in parks. And those ones, they rely on those local flowers to live.
Right.
So
I've seen those swarms around periodically, not so much lately, but when they do that, I mean, often people call the police or they call someone.
The fire department.
Yeah,
and,
exactly.
Yeah.
So doesn't that impacts that wild population a little bit, doesn't it?
Yeah, it depends on who they call. There are people that do live removal, will
Okay.
come and take the swarm and, knock it, put it into a box and, haul it away and put it somewhere where it can do some work.
Yeah.
But sometimes they just come and they get cans of Raid and just spray them down, and
man.
they're
Yeah.
done because they're afraid of the bees. They don't
Yeah.
want them there.
Yeah.
So.
There's we're coming to the end of our time here, but there is one quote that I really enjoyed, and I think you know it. Albert Einstein is reputed to have said, "If the bee disappears off the surface of the globe, then man would only have 4 years of life left." In some ways, maybe you can briefly summarize in the last few seconds we have, why are bees important?
Well, people like to eat, so eating's kind of an important facet of life, and that's what the bees do. Without the pollination, we're not going to get all those fruits and vegetables and stuff. So.
And it's true of cotton also, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
So there's, like, I read someplace, 80% of almost everything we have is due to some kind of pollination. Well, Carlos, thanks so much for being here today and enlightening our listeners and our viewers. I really enjoyed it. And thanks to all of you for being here with us at Our Ventura. We look forward to seeing you again in the future.